recorded on the. Now we are recording. So if anybody wants to get a copy, I can send it to them.
Okay. Are you guys going to post it? Do you guys have a website that you post these things on?
Yes, we've got a website and a Facebook page.
Oh, okay. If you do decide to post it, would you send me a link later?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Okay.
So are you still busy? You're still busy in the anti-war movement then in San Francisco, right, Michael?
Yeah, I'm the vice president of the San Francisco chapter of Veterans for Peace, which is a national organization. We have a few international chapters as well. And then I'm also a co-founder of Pivot to Peace, which is a coalition of the peace community and the Chinese community, focusing on pivoting to peace with China, basically. And then I'm also the co-chair of the Veterans for Peace China Working Group, which is a focus group within the national organization, Veterans for Peace.
Are you going to mention that bill in Congress, what is it, the Taiwan something act?
The Taiwan Policy Act, yes, I was going to talk about that at the end of my, the last part of my presentation.
Okay. Here comes Earl Fisher, one of our regular attendees. Earl, are you there? To unmute.
I'll be right back.
Earl, can you hear us? Earl, we need you to unmute.
Okay.
And here comes Carol Tritchler, another one of our members.
Okay.
Carol, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I don't know, it's kind of faint.
Earl, can you hear us?
I just turned up the sound. Can you hear me?
Oh, good. Yeah, we can hear you real well.
Thank you.
About 2 more minutes and then we'll get started.
Okay.
Walt, you added a passcode. Was that you were just kind of trying to do an extra layer of security?
Oh, yeah, well, yes, I wanted to. In the past, some people said they couldn't get on without the passcode, so I put it on
Okay. It
all
did
the
ask me
communications.
for it.
So that it worked then.
Yeah, it worked. I didn't enter the password at first, and I was looking at that, and then I went back to your email and thought, oh, I better put it in, and it worked fine. But your link put me in Facebook first, and then I had to get out of there. So but I mean, it was fine. I mean, it worked. It just kind of threw me for a minute.
Yeah, in the past, when I didn't put the passcode in, some people couldn't get in. Some people got in without it and some people couldn't.
Yeah.
Hi, Steve.
Hello. Hi, Steve.
Oh, hello, Steve.
Oh, there's Earl.
Hi, Earl. Okay, we can hear you now, Earl.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Get started, and because I'll see people that are trying to enter, and I can just let them on as they show up. I want to welcome everybody. We don't have a big crowd right now, but hopefully we'll get a few more to our West Suburban Peace Coalition Educational Forum for Tuesday, October 18th. I'm Walt Zlotow, Coalition President, and we are based in Glen Ellen, Illinois, which is a Chicago western suburb. And we hold these forums the third Tuesday of every month. And our mission is to promote peace in Chicago's western suburbs and beyond through these educational forums via Zoom on peace-related issues. Our annual peace essay contest to promote awareness of and foster a more peaceful nation and world. We lobby the president and Congress to use diplomacy instead of war to resolve disputes. And we use social media and print electronic journalism to promote peace by ending current wars involving drone-fired bombs and/or life-degrading economic sanctions. Okay, as usual, we'll begin with a very brief update of the Ukraine war before we get into tonight's topic. Today is day 243 of the Russo-Ukraine war, and it's the 243rd day that the United States has refused whatsoever to enter negotiations to create a ceasefire and to begin diplomatic negotiations to end the war and have a negotiated settlement. And unfortunately, the longer the war goes on, oh, here's somebody else coming in. Hang on. The longer the war goes on, the worse it's getting because both sides have hardened their positions. Of course, Russia has annexed 4 provinces, including the 2 in the Donbass. And Ukraine is adamant that they're going to continue the war until they claw back every square inch of territory they've lost. And we're continuing to funnel tens of billions of dollars into the war zone. So we're on track for just a greater and greater catastrophe. And that's why we in the peace community we're not promoting victory by either side. We're promoting negotiations to end the war. And we just have to keep working until hopefully that will occur. Okay, now we're going to pivot to tonight's topic, which is the second major either confrontation or potential confrontation facing the United States with a nuclear power, and that is our confrontation with China over Taiwan. The title of our topic is No War with China over Taiwan, and our speaker tonight is Michael Wong, who is Vice President of Veterans for Peace, San Francisco chapter. He's a co-founder of the Pivot to Peace and co-chair of the Veterans for Peace China Working Group. Michael has been published in the anthologies of Veterans of War, Veterans of Peace, A Matter of Conscience, and Waging Peace in Vietnam. He is also featured in the documentary film, Sir, No Sir, about the Vietnam era GI anti-war movement, during which he refused US Army orders to Vietnam, was briefly imprisoned in the Presidio Stockade, and was in exile in Canada. Mike is a retired social worker with a master's degree in social work. Please welcome Michael Wong.
Thank you for inviting me here tonight. Let me start off with just kind of a brief background to the US Cold War on China, which is going on right now. As most people in the peace community, I think, are aware, the United States has been launching war after war against various countries with the idea that we are the policemen of the world. We tell other nations what to do, and if they don't obey our orders, we make them obey at the point of a gun. So whether we're talking about Iraq, Vietnam, Haiti, Somalia, Afghanistan, any nation that doesn't fall in line with what we think they ought to be doing or what we tell them to do, we declare them to be a threat, we declare them to be evil, and we do whatever it takes to bring them to heel. In the case of both Russia and China, different politicians high up in the American hierarchy have declared them to be existential threats. The word existential is an important word. When you say that somebody or something is an existential, sorry?
No, okay. We're on.
Huh?
We're
Okay,
on.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
turned it up. Sorry.
When you say something's an existential threat, that means its mere existence is a threat. And that leaves no room for compromise. When President Obama was in office, he declared a so-called pivot to Asia, in which he moved 60% of our naval force to the areas around China to surround China with our naval power. He built up our bases and our forces in Asia, and he declared that he wanted to contain China's peaceful economic rise. Hillary Clinton famously said, "I don't want my grandchildren to grow up in a world dominated by the Chinese." This is a fear that the US elite have had all along, which is that if we don't dominate the world, someone else will. And if you look back at European history or Western history, there's a long history of different countries fighting each other for dominance. You know, you think of the early medieval wars, you think of the colonial period when different nations of Europe went out and colonized different parts of the world. This leads to what's called the zero-sum game of strategic thinking among major portions of the Western elite. That it's zero-sum, either you are the conqueror or you are the victim, so there's no other alternative. Let me just present a book to you that I would recommend if you want to get what the Western elite's view of the world is. It's called Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? By Graham Allison, who's a former Undersecretary of State, Undersecretary of Defense, and he was the founding dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. And he talks about past history and how different nations fought wars for dominance and what happened. World War I and World War II are among his leading examples. So this is the Western view of history and international relations. I would like to also recommend another book called China Reconnects. This is written by Wang Wu. He's a former vice chancellor of Hong Kong University, and he's now a professor at the University of Singapore. So he's Chinese by background, but he's also politically neutral. And he talks about how China has developed its ancient philosophy and its modern thinking and its view of the world. China's view of the world has always been very different. China was a large country, an advanced civilization with a large population, good natural resources, and 1,000 years ago it invented gunpowder, 400 years before anybody else. Yet it never went out and tried to conquer the world, even though it had a 400-year monopoly on gunpowder, as well as being a major power in a major country. The reason it didn't do that was it felt that the best way to survive long-term is to simply secure your own borders, secure your own position, and trade with the rest of the world peacefully. And they believe in trade being win-win, because if you don't cut a deal that the other side benefits from, eventually, one way or another, they're going to end the deal. And the Chinese idea was that if you go out and try to conquer people, even if you succeed, you are then responsible for running that country, dealing with the native peoples, dealing with rebellions, constantly fighting. It's simply not worth it from their point of view when you can get the same benefits by trading and have it be win-win. So the Chinese philosophy of win-win is what they've done for thousands of years. And because of that, China has survived. It has a 5,000-year history. So many Western empires came and went during that time that China views world conquest today as a fool's errand, just as it's always been. So that's not China's goal. The Western elite doesn't understand that. And when the Chinese leaders say that, they don't believe them. They think it's some kind of trick. Thus, Hillary Clinton's statement, "I don't want my grandchildren to grow up in a world dominated by the Chinese." They think that the Chinese behave like them, and that if they allow China to become economically successful, it will have enough economic power to raise a strong military and dominate the world in the way that the Americans do. And that's simply not what China's going to do. So that gives you a little bit of background. President Trump, as you're aware, started a trade war, sanctions. When COVID came along, he talked about Kung Flu, he talked about the Chinese virus, and so on and so forth. And during that time, tensions dramatically escalated between China and the United States. The Chinese American population became collateral damage with thousands of hate incidents against our community. By August 2021, there had been registered over 9,000 hate incidents against Asians during that period due to the escalating rhetoric and escalating tensions between the United States and China. When President Biden was elected, he continued to escalate the hybrid war in China. He's running carrier battle groups through the Taiwan Straits, the South China Sea, talking about freedom of navigation. But freedom of navigation is maybe sending a destroyer or a cruiser through to demonstrate that you assert your right to go through there. Sending an entire aircraft carrier battle group is not freedom of navigation, it's intimidation. So there's a difference there. United States also under Biden has been sending government officials, US government officials to Taiwan. It's been landing planes, military planes in Taiwan, taking off from Taiwan and then patrolling the Chinese coast, which means they're essentially launching a US military operation from Taiwan. They've openly had US military personnel training the military on Taiwan. And they've been openly talking about forming alliances against China, such as the Quad, the combination of the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, our AUKUS, Australia, UK, United States. They're talking about bringing NATO to Asia to fight China in a potential war. So things are escalating, and they're escalating under both Democratic and Republican administrations. There's really no difference between them in terms of their war hawk positions. And why are they doing this? They're doing this as part of that goal to dominate the world and dominate any country that could be independent of them, of the United States, and encourage other countries to follow their own course. The latest thing is the Taiwan Policy Act, which is going through Congress right now. They're making some adjustments to it. We don't know the exact form that it will come out in the end, but the things that are in it that seem to be kind of central features are declaring Taiwan to be a non-NATO ally, which is the same as declaring Taiwan to be an independent country from China, which I'll talk about in a little while. They're also talking about arming Taiwan using what they call a porcupine strategy. What they figured is that if China should try to reunify with Taiwan by force, that the Taiwan army would have to fight alone for at least some time before the United States could get our own troops there and back them up. So they want to make Taiwan into a porcupine, i.e. arming it, giving enough backup supplies so that they could fight on for months without resupply, training their military, which right now they have basically a minimum military. There is a draft, but most people serve only 4 months, which basically gives them, basic training and perhaps some specialty training. And that's all they do. They don't have a huge standing army like the United States does, for example. So they want to increase that to 1 year of service, and they want to make Taiwan strong enough that it could fight essentially a Ukraine-type war for a number of months. That's because China has a defensive perimeter around its coast made up of missiles, air power, and naval vessels called area denial, anti-access area denial, which basically means that China is able to project enough force as long as it's close to its coastline to fend off any attack by the United States. The United States knows that and knows that it would be difficult for us to get in there. That's why they're doing this with Taiwan. As to what the people on Taiwan want, polls pretty much show that they want to maintain the status quo. China's policy all along towards Taiwan has been one of eventual peaceful reunification with no specific time frame stated. The Chinese strategy has been to develop trade, tourism, friendly relations with Taiwan. China's advancing economically very rapidly. If you go to China today, you see, especially in the cities, a very modern civilization. In some ways, you see things that are even more modern than what we have. If you go to the countryside in China, which I've been to, you see that they've developed it very rapidly. You can see old buildings right next to brand new buildings. And when you talk to people, you see that they're very optimistic because they see that year by year, their living standards increase rather dramatically. Within the space of 30 years, people went from living in mud huts with no running water and no electricity to living in modern housing with water, electricity, computers, cell phones, everything that we consider modern. So if you talk to people in China, and if you look at polls, the Chinese government has almost a 90%, or in some cases, slightly over 90% approval rating from most of the population because of the fantastic economic progress they've made within the space of, one person's lifetime. Trade with China, mainland China and Taiwan, was 166 billion in 2020. Thousands of tourists and business people went back and forth between the mainland and Taiwan. So both sides were benefiting from the status quo. China's belief was that if they just continued the process, at some point when both economies, when the mainland economy continues to develop, everyone would just see that it's in the best interest of everybody to just reunify under the idea of one country, two systems. Whether that would happen and in what time frame, who knows? But China did not want war. People in Taiwan don't want war. If you look at polls taken on Taiwan, the majority always says they want to maintain the status quo because it's win-win for both sides. In terms of whether people want eventual reunification or independence, polls swing back and forth. The Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, at one point was in office. Their leader met with Xi Jinping in a very memorable event and moved relations between the two places forward substantially. Then the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, got into power and they moved things back in the opposite direction. They're more independence minded. That increased the tension between the two countries, but it didn't destabilize it. It's only recently when the United States has been putting more pressure on Taiwan to move towards independence and ratcheting up our own confrontation with China that the tension between the two sides really took a dramatic jump for the worst. Taiwan has been a province of China since ancient times. The constitution of the Taiwan government says that it's the government of all of China, which it was at one time prior to its defeat in the Civil War in 1949. The official name of the Taiwan government is the Republic of China. Its official language is Mandarin. The state-owned airline is called China Airlines. And the independence people in Taiwan, they're starting to call themselves Taiwanese. But there's an ethnic problem with that. There's a minority group in Taiwan who are Taiwanese Aborigine. They're native Taiwanese people. They're Aborigines who lived in Taiwan since ancient times prior to the coming of the Han Chinese back during the last dynasty, going back several hundred years, about 800 years. And they're the people who, like the Native Americans, have the real right to be called Taiwanese because they are native Aborigine Taiwanese. So for the Chinese on Taiwan to start calling themselves Taiwanese would be like a white person in America calling themselves Native Americans. It's simply not true. They're essentially stealing the name of a minority ethnic group that in both ancient and modern times were essentially oppressed by the Chinese, which are the majority and have been for a long time. So it would be like a white person calling themselves a Native American and ignoring the way that Native Americans have been oppressed in this country. It's a similar type of designation. In terms of what's happening with the United States, 50 years ago when Nixon went to China, he opened up relations with China, and there was what was called the Shanghai Communique, which was issued by both nations and outlined the basic terms of the relationship between our two nations. Basic to the Shanghai Communique is the idea that there's only one China, and Taiwan is a part of China, just like one of the 50 states is a part of the United States. And what was stated was that the governance of China is an issue to be settled between Chinese themselves, which means that the United States will stay out of the issue of whether the government on Taiwan or the government in Beijing should lead what part of the country. That's between Chinese to settle among themselves, however they will. There were three communiques, each of which was called a Shanghai Communique, but that's the basis of all three of them. So for the United States now to try to move Taiwan towards independence pushes up against the red lines of China, just like we pushed against the red lines of other countries as well, not just Russia, but Iran, other countries. And that risks war, because if push comes to shove, China will fight to keep a part of it as its territory. To ask China to give up permanently Taiwan as a province of China would be like asking us to give up Texas or California. I mean, just imagine if there was a group of people in Texas or in California or some other state that advocated independence for their state, and China intervened to try to back up and enforce that independence. How would the United States react? Well, when we do the same thing to China over Taiwan, that's exactly what China is faced with. So this is a very dangerous situation. Neither the mainland Chinese nor the Chinese on Taiwan want war. Both of them want to maintain the status quo until such time as both sides agree to peaceful reunification. And that's been a status quo that's been stable for 50 years. So if we simply did nothing, nothing would change. Both sides would continue to benefit economically and through tourism and, you know, friendly relations with each other. And this whole situation would be stable. Our actions are destabilizing what would otherwise be a stable situation and pushing towards war, as we always seem to do. So I'll end my presentation there. If anybody has questions, I'll respond to the questions.
Yeah, Michael, I'd like to kick it off by saying, I think most of us that follow this issue assume that it was Trump that radically changed the one China policy. But I think you alluded to the fact that when Obama announced the pivot to Asia with 60% of the naval forces heading out toward the China neighborhood, didn't that really kick off the major change in US policy, or would it still be what Trump did?
That did kick it off. And China was concerned at that time. And they did start to build up their military defenses in response to the American buildup. But at the same time, China still believed that, you know, China and America had been friends since the Richard Nixon days. And China wanted to continue that relationship. The last thing it wanted was to have another Cold War, and it certainly did not want to have a hot war. So it continued trying during that period to repair relations. They kept saying, you know, look, we're not out to replace the United States. We are working within the rules-based international order, which is international law, not blind American dictates, but it's international law. And we don't want conflict. When Trump came along, you might recall in the early days of the Trump administration, Trump went to China and met with Xi Jinping and was given the royal treatment and so on and so forth. And then eventually Xi Jinping came to the United States and met with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, and so on and so forth. And China was hoping at that time that even though Trump was very erratic and all of this stuff, that somehow they could convince him that we don't need to be enemies. That all changed with COVID.
Yeah.
What happened when Wuhan broke out was China was dealing with a whole new virus that nobody even knew about before. It took them a number of weeks to figure out what it was and figure out what to do. And then they had that very severe lockdown, which within the space of a month or so actually stopped COVID code in Wuhan. And as soon as they figured out what they were dealing with, they told the United States and they told the World Health Organization everything they knew, including the genetic code of COVID. And Xi Jinping himself called Donald Trump and said, look, this is a very dangerous virus. The world needs to take this very seriously. We've already transmitted all the information we have to you. You guys need to take steps to defend yourself from this virus immediately. Trump just blew it off. And the rest is history. China has a few thousand deaths from COVID. We have over 1 million. The reason China has so few deaths in a population 4 times our size is because they did very severe lockdowns, which a lot of Americans said were human rights violations because we were locking down an entire population, or China was locking down an entire population. But what happened was the Chinese government moved swift and hard, locked everything down, stopped the virus code, and then opened up completely once the virus was stopped. That's why their economy, although it grew at a much slower pace, continued to grow all through COVID. While ours contracted at various points, and then we opened up and it went forward again, and we kind of, so what we did was a bunch of half measures, even under Biden. What China did was full-on measures all the way. They acted swiftly and decisively, and they did the same thing again when the new variations Omicron hit Shanghai. And people complained about it. Even in Shanghai, it was difficult, and people complained in Shanghai. But once they stopped it, everything opened up again. So people suffered lockdowns for a month or 2 months, but then it was over. Everything opened up again. Whereas we go kind of half measures, half measures, half measures. So we have half lockdowns, half, massive amounts of death, half lockdowns, half deaths, blah, blah, blah. We kind of muddle along. People could argue which is better. And if you're a human rights purist and you say freedom is more important than human life, then you would say that China is committing human rights violations. But the Chinese view is that human life is more important than the kind of freedoms that we think of in the United States, that if you're not alive, you can't exercise any other freedoms. That's their theory. So for them, for their point of view, they're right. So that's the difference between our two approaches. Sorry, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you did. So, but to amplify a little bit, so Trump, then he used that anti-China meme to gin up his political base, and that just accelerated the whole anti-China agenda, it appears.
Yes, and Biden's followed suit. So things have not gotten better under Biden. If anything, they've gotten worse because they're pushing up against the one China principle more and more. And they're trying to move Taiwan towards permanent independence. And this porcupine strategy that they have, it's a dangerous strategy because it doesn't make sense for China to just do nothing and let this happen. It makes sense that China would try to cut it off at some point, which they can do. When Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, we sent the Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier battle group to provide security. And there was some concern that this could result in a shooting incident, which fortunately the Chinese maneuvered in a way to avoid it. Instead of trying to stop Pelosi head on or doing anything with Pelosi directly, what China did was they had a whole series of naval exercises. And those exercises were in 6 areas around Taiwan. And what they were live fire naval exercises. And what they did was they basically surrounded Taiwan on all sides, did live fire naval exercises just to show their strength and the fact that they had the naval capability to blockade Taiwan if they wanted to. At the same time, the Ronald Reagan carrier task force was heading towards Taiwan to provide security. They turned around and ran.
Oh,
So that's the
Didn't
first
hear that.
time that I've ever heard of an American carrier battle group running from a fight. And that speaks to the naval strength of China. This means that if we continue to develop this porcupine strategy where we try to build up Taiwan to the point where they could military resist and fight a Ukraine-style war to the last Taiwan president, it would make sense for China to try to cut that strategy short, because that strategy is being used in conjunction with the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, which is, despite its name, it's actually the right-wing party. They're trying to educate their youth that they're Taiwanese, not Chinese, and move towards independence. So those are trends that China might want to cut off. And if China chose to do so, it has the naval capability to do so. They could blockade Taiwan, cut off any military support, prevent any military supplies from reaching them. And then we'd be faced with either we fight a war at sea or we back off. And that would be a very dangerous moment if that were to happen. The United States could lay sanctions on China, of course, but if we did that, it's likely to have the same effect as the sanctions that we have on Russia right now, which of course seems to be hurting Europe and us more than the Russians.
Yes, they are.
It would be even more so with China because, we're much more integrated with the Chinese economy than we are with the Russian economy. China has economic strategic depth in that they can trade with the entire global South, which they have better relations with than we do simply because we've always exploited and oppressed the global South, and China has not. They have good relations with Russia, Iran. Relations with India are improving. They could, if we were to fight a sanctions war with China, probably we would lose. Probably we would get hurt more than China.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I have a friend who got a degree in the United States and now works in Shanghai and is approaching retirement. And instead of, she is of Taiwanese descent, instead of retiring back to Taiwan, she is considering retiring to Japan. Are there many people who are kind of getting scared about this looming situation and thinking that they want to kind of get out of the zone, so to speak?
That's actually complicated. There's a lot of people who are scared. Different people are reacting in different ways. If a war breaks out between China and the United States, a big war, Japan has declared that any move that China makes towards Taiwan, Japan would get involved. And Japan is probably the US's closest ally in Asia, followed by South Korea. South Korea is more complicated. So if there was a big war between the United States and China, Japan would be sending supplies, US naval forces would be going from bases in Japan towards Taiwan or China. And it's conceivable that that especially if there's any firing done by the Japanese or from bases in Japan, or if we're sending a lot of our forces from Japan, it's conceivable that Japan could get hit, that Japan, especially if they fulfilled their pledge to get involved in a war on the US side, Japan would become a combatant nation. So if I were living in China and I wanted to escape the war, Japan would not be a place I would go. Personally, if it were me, I would go to, and I wanted to stay in Asia, I would go to Vietnam. Vietnam's a neutral country. It's, it's still poor because of all the damage done during the Vietnam War, but it's coming up very fast. And the cities are quite developed. And especially if you're an American, there's, whole American communities there. I've been there, I visited with, actually Veterans for Peace has a chapter there, and I visited with them, and I went on a tour of Vietnam with them. We visited a bunch of the different cities in the countryside. Vietnam has been very clear that they would be neutral in any war between the United States and China. They'd be a better place to go. But in terms of people being scared, yeah, people are scared. People are scared here in the United States. There was a crackdown on Chinese scientists under both the Trump and the Biden administration. And, the last figure I heard was that 1,400 Chinese scientists, including many of them who were American citizens, have left left the United States to go back to China because they were afraid of, being cracked down on. The FBI arrested them, and people were arrested for accused of giving secrets to China when they in fact had done nothing wrong. And most of them got off because they were innocent, but it still, sullied their reputation, disrupted their careers. People are afraid. People have gone. So there's Chinese here leaving for China. And a lot of Chinese students that were studying here have gone back to China. There used to be a lot of Chinese students that would come here to study because people in China really admired the United States for a long time. Xi Jinping sent his own daughter to study at Harvard. She graduated from Harvard. But with the big crackdown, Chinese are changing their mind. So there's a lot of fear, I think, both ways. And it doesn't surprise me that an American in China might think about, where they want to go.
The anti-Chinese meme that Trump started, that, like you said, there were thousands of incidents against Asian people. It reminds me a little bit about what happened to the Japanese in America during World War II. It's a demonization of the other. They don't look like the typical American, so they're not treated well. And it's terrible.
Yes, that's right. And actually, there's been some talk in the Chinese community about what would happen if, we got put in concentration camps or internment camps, just like the Japanese did. So there's been some talk about that. People are afraid.
Can I jump in a second again? My
Yes.
friend who studied in the United States is from Taiwan originally, but she works in Shanghai. So she's thinking about where to retire to after she leaves Shanghai. But the description you made would fit a Taiwanese native as well, I think. Very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
You're on mute.
Yeah, there.
Okay, some 55 years ago, I was in a study group on Taiwan and Qunan, a second island. There were two islands that were involved. Taiwan was one of them, and there was another one. And I can't.
Quemoy?
Hanoi? Yeah.
Quemoy?
Yes. What's the status of Hanoi today?
Oh, so basically they're still under the control of the government on Taiwan.
Okay.
The shooting that went back and forth during the Cold War, has not repeated since then. And basically nothing has happened regarding them. They're still the same. They're under the control of the
So
government.
that's
of Taiwan.
another large island, right? That of people that are separated from the Chinese mainland.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, and nothing has happened since the Cold War.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a question on the chat from Jill Paulus. Her question is, the federal banking system, if they want to keep the dollar as global currency, cause the US to fight China. Biden hinted about the economic threat of China. What is your opinion?
Oh, okay. So there's been a lot of talk about that. There's been some talk that, how since the Ukraine war broke out, Russia demanded payment for their oil in rubles. And there was some thought that with our sanctions, the value of the ruble would decline. And in fact, it's actually gone up because, it's been trading with other countries using rubles or yen or whatever. And so if we were to do the same thing with China, and if the same pattern were to emerge, which seems logical, various countries have been talking about trading in other currencies, rubles, yen, whatever. And if that were to happen, it could erode the solidity of the dollar as a universal currency. And if that were to happen, it would substantially weaken US power economically. So I think the US has overplayed its hand at this point. The reality is no country, not the United States, not China, not Russia, not India, not Europe, no country can really dominate the whole world indefinitely. You know, different countries have exerted immense power for a time. But if you think of all the ancient empires of the past, you know, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, Alexander the Great, the Mongols, you know, any of them, even the colonial period, you know, these nations come to power, they build these huge empires, but for one country to rule such a large area is a massive undertaking, and they eventually exhaust themselves, and then the empire collapses. And if the countries are lucky, they survive and become just normal countries again, which is fine. If they're not lucky, they fall apart and they cease to exist, as some past empires have. So the whole game of empire is unsustainable. They can sustain it for a few centuries at most. And it just harms everybody. It's a stupid fool's game. That's why China never played it. And that's why China has been around for 5,000 years while all these other empires came and went. If we would just take a page from China, everybody could be better off. China keeps talking about win-win, and we keep dismissing it as, you know, some kind of Chinese trick. But really, if you look back at Chinese history, that's the truth as Chinese see it.
Michael, I don't know if I don't know if you've heard this or not, but I understand that whenever the U.S. intelligence offices do simulated war games, if we did get into a shooting war with China, nuclear war, we lose every time. Have you heard that?
Yes, that's correct. The RAND Corporation has done simulations. The Pentagon has done simulations. And yes, according to our own simulations, we lose every time.
It's mystifying.
We don't learn from experience. I mean, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, we don't learn from experience. We lose wars and we still think we're big cheese. We think we're invincible. And you know, the fact is we haven't won a war since World War II. And the reason we haven't won a war is because we're on the wrong side of history. We don't understand these countries. You know, why did the Taliban win the war? You know, we say the Taliban commits all these human rights violations, they're oppressing women and so on and so forth. And by our value systems, that's true. You know, I don't personally agree with a lot of the things that the Taliban do. But the point is, the only way any force can win a guerrilla war against a militarily superior force is with the support of the people. The fact that the Taliban won proves that they had the support of a majority of the people, which means that we failed to understand the people's culture, the people's history, and what their belief systems are. Whether we agree with those belief systems or not, that's not the point. The point is we cannot force people to change themselves at the point of the gun. You know, it would be like going over to your neighbor's house with a gun and saying, you need to treat your wife better or else. It's like, you know, you think that's going to be a successful intervention? It doesn't make sense. And especially being Chinese American and knowing more about the Chinese culture and talking to first generation immigrants and then going to China and talking to people there, it's very obvious to me that we don't understand the Chinese, you know, and we're trying to dictate to them that they should be like us when we have our own problems at home. It just doesn't make sense. If we would just leave well enough alone, things would develop on their own.
Michael, as opposed to the Ukraine war, in the Ukraine war, there's a faction of the Republican Party that's pushing back and says we got to stop sending billions and do negotiating. They may be doing that more for politics than for peace, but they're still pushing back. But do you see any segment of the US political structure that's pushing back on this ramping up tension with China?
No.
That's what I thought. I haven't seen one political leader say this is a really self-destructive, foolish policy.
Nobody, I haven't seen anybody in Congress or the White House say that, but there are a lot of retired people who are saying that. And actually, even if you look at this book by Graham Ellison that I showed you, he's a former Secretary of Defense, and he's very pro-American. He's totally pro-American. But he makes the point that we don't understand China, and that a war with China would be incredibly destructive. So there's a lot of even pro-American people who were in high positions that may not agree with a lot of things about China or about the Chinese government, but they still argue that war would be an unmitigated disaster. And I should mention that if we were to have a war with China and they sunk one of our carriers,
Oh,
can you imagine what our response would be? It would be possible to have a step-by-step escalation all the way to nuclear war. So that's the ultimate danger, is that the escalation cycle would get out of control and we would end up in an all-out nuclear war, and that would just be the end of the world.
well, I wish you had more, there was more optimistic news, but looking at it rationally, it's all bleak at this point. There doesn't seem to be any push to have inject common sense into our policy with China over Taiwan.
Yeah, the only thing we can do about it as peace activists is to just keep being out there and putting out this information, try to educate people, and try to at least create some controversy to make people stop and think. If we can even slow the momentum towards war, the longer this goes on without a shooting war, the more time we buy to create discussion, create controversy, and slowly change public opinion and ultimately government opinion. If you think about, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, the Afghan War, it took us 10 years, 20 years to finally change the course of the United States. But if we can follow the same course of activism that we did with other wars, that's our best hope of preventing an all-out war.
Okay, any more questions or comments? We're just about butting up to the 1 hour mark, and we always try to finish in 1 hour because we all have a busy agenda. Anybody else with a comment or question?
Is there a good website to go to or for more information to follow up on this talk or learn more?
Yes, there's two websites. One is the Pivot to Peace website, which is peacepivot.org. Again, that's peacepivot.org. And then the other is the Veterans for Peace China Working Group website, which is, it's a long title, but if you just go to veteransforpeace.org and you click on working groups, and then you click on China Working Groups, you'll find it.
That's great information, Michael. And this was a fascinating 1 hour. And I learned so much. I'm sure we all did.
Yeah.
Really painted a broad picture that gives us much to think about and to worry about, actually, too. But it forces us to continue to be active, like you said. So I thank you very much for presenting tonight. And we will.
Thank you for having me.
And we will be, we have got a video of this, which I'll share with everybody. And we will be promoting a summary of the talk tonight on our website, on our Facebook page, and on various anti-war Facebook pages. So we're going to push to get the information that you presented out tonight. So thank you again very much.
You're welcome.
And on that note, hopefully we'll have better news on both Ukraine and China when we meet in November. Tentatively, I'd like to have a presentation on the nuclear crisis with North Korea, which has been heating up dramatically in the last couple of weeks. So that's the tentative topic of our November educational forum. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for attending. I wish we had more, but we're going to get the word out, and hopefully we'll see you all next month. So have a good evening.
Thanks.
It's you and I, Earl.
Yeah, okay, well,
Thanks for attending. That was great.
thank you. It was a great meeting. Really a good presentation.
Wow. Yeah, I really work to get knowledgeable speakers. I really enjoy it very much when we get somebody, because I learn a lot. I mean, I study a lot, but I still learn a lot on every one of these educational forums. And I really wish we could get more people to attend them. But we'll keep pushing. So again, thanks for your support. Have a good evening.
You too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.